doing the series on what it means to have a relationship with God. The series is called Start Here. It's based on this little book. If any of you have an interest in reading along, there are copies on a table out in the narthex, and you'd be happy to read along. I'm doing 2 more sermons on the series. Last week, the series was called It's All About Relationship, or it starts with Jesus. And the focus of last week's message was when we think about starting a relationship with Christ, we're not talking about just making some sort of religious commitment or becoming a part of an organization. We're talking about relationship. Today, we're going to talk about obstacles. You ever run into an obstacle? We can run into obstacles. They're destination obstacles. You're trying to get somewhere, and you run into something that keeps you from getting there. There are career obstacles. You have a job that you'd like to get, and you work as hard as you can, but you run into some barrier, and you can't quite get there. Medical obstacles. Obstacles to our dreams, and sometimes there are obstacles to our faith. The word obstacle implies that something is getting in the way of a person reaching a destination. Today we're talking about obstacles to getting started in a relationship with Jesus. And you can encounter an obstacle if it's a matter of trying to start a relationship with Jesus for the first time, or maybe you have wandered away or become distant from Christ and you're wanting to get back in a relationship, and you run into something that keeps you from getting there. I want to start by reading a section from this book, and it's a testimony from a person named Paige. Paige is she is a 25-year-old middle school teacher, and this chapter 2 starts with this story. Paige says, "I knew and accepted God as a child, but later I just kind of drifted away. But after I separated myself from God and from church, there was definitely a season of Him stirring and working to draw me back into a relationship with Him. At the time, I was in college. I was going through a season of feeling hugely disillusioned about Christianity. All of it felt tiny and false to me. And I began to wonder about everything, right down to God's very existence. At that time, a friend of mine brought me a documentary about my favorite Christian songwriter, Sarah Groves. Somehow I liked Sarah. She was authentic and real to me, and I respected her music. And I remember lying in my bed in my student apartment and crying through the entire DVD. In the film, Sarah and her husband pack up their tour bus, drive to Louisiana right after Hurricane Katrina. They didn't know what they were headed for or what they would find, but they had the resources, so they just went. I realized that night that in the middle of my emotional turmoil and spiritual confusion, I had all but lost faith in humanity and in God's ability to redeem it. I realized that Jesus Christ is different from the stale, hostile religion that I'd encountered so frequently. I think I was struggling with doubt. I was worried that maybe it was illogical and silly to believe there was a God. I worried that this whole religion thing was a construct designed to assuage my fears and shortcomings of the human race. There were so many things I didn't know about science and philosophy and life in general. So I worried about blindly buying into something that so many people consider to be nonsense. If they'd searched and studied and analyzed and found it was all impossible, then maybe it was. What could I know that they didn't? I wrote this in a blog back in 2008. I'm just desperately looking for answers. I am not looking for anything other than the truth. And whatever it is, I'll follow it passionately and wholeheartedly. In the midst of this time, I started a conversation with God. I think prayer came before anything else. I wanted to find a way to communicate with God honestly. I figured that He knew my heart and my confusion in all of it, and that He would help me sort it out. I love this next sentence. I had a very strong conviction that God would prefer my honest doubt over any kind of pious insincerity. So I decided to just lay it all out on the table before God. I felt a little weird at first because I still had some nagging doubts and wondered if maybe I was just praying to the wall. But something kept me going even so. I began in church every once in a while, and I was very timid and reluctant about it. I would roll my eyes, squirm uncomfortably, stifle a gag during just about every sermon. I had such a low tolerance for any kind of churchiness, but I did manage to leave somehow feeling encouraged. I don't know how it happens or how it all logically works out, but the closer I got to God and the more I find a way to be authentic with Him, to let go of all my needs for control and for power, I see that I really am worth something. To Him, to the world, and I guess to myself too. I still have my moments of struggling, but it feels like there's been a shift in my core. And those kinds of changes can't be faked or brought about on our own. I'm never going to find all the logical guarantees that I might want, but somehow, through the mystery of God, His presence is unmistakable in my life. Page refers to a couple of obstacles, or alludes to them in those couple of pages. Here's a big idea for today's message. The big idea is that obstacles are real, but that there's always a way around them. There are real obstacles. There are things that are hard to overcome for a person who wants to get started with Jesus. And you can have every good intention, but still find it hard to just get there. And here's why I believe there is always a way around obstacles. The reason I believe that is because I believe that God wants to be found. God is not making it difficult. He is not hiding from us and making us do all the work. He wants to be found. And God wants a relationship with us, I think, more than we will ever want a relationship with Him. So that's why I think there's always a way around obstacles. Let me just rehearse or review a few of the obstacles that are kind of common ones. The first obstacle is as simple as just a lack of information. Some people never enter a relationship with Christ because they never hear much about Him. And it's just a matter of not knowing that Jesus wants a relationship with you. Writing to a group of Jewish and Gentile Christians in Rome who are not getting along too well with each other, Paul wrote, "If you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and if you believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you'll be saved. It is with your heart that you believe and are justified. It's with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in Him will never be put to shame. For there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord over all. He richly blesses all who call on Him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the person they've not believed in? And how can they believe in one whom they have never heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." So one reason some people don't get into a relationship with Jesus is they just never hear the good news. And they may even hear about Jesus, but hear about Him in a way that doesn't really feel like good news. So those are some things that can be obstacles. Another obstacle that's coming up is the obstacle of intellectual barriers. Some people have a hard time starting a relationship with Christ because logically they just can't get there. And it never makes sense to them, and they can't get all of their questions answered. And the Apostle Paul knew that this would be an obstacle. He wrote to people in Corinth that for some people, this whole story about Jesus will never be much more than just kind of foolishness. It'll always feel kind of foolish to them. But he also said that others will experience it as powerful. And that in the midst of their intellectual doubts, there's a power to hearing about Jesus and trying to follow Jesus, trying to learn more about him. And the word powerful is an interesting one. It means a physical force of energy and meaning. So sometimes even people with intellectual barriers, or they want to believe, but it just can't get their logic around it. Sometimes hearing the gospel has this powerful impact of meaning. And there's just a sense of, I don't understand it, but I'm at least curious about it, and perhaps sometimes get to the point where I know that this is true. But there are intellectual barriers. I think one of the best ways to overcome intellectual barriers is to realize, just to be honest about the fact, that reason and science sometimes lead to conclusions that prove not to be true, and faith sometimes leads to conclusions that are. All three are valuable ways of discovering what is true, and all three can be fallible. Sometimes we reason and reach wrong conclusions. Sometimes science believes something for a while, and then they discover something else, and they come to a different conclusion. The author of Hebrews wrote, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for. It's assurance about what we can't see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was already visible." A lot of times barriers fall in this area of science. And people think, if I come to Christ, I have to give up my respect for science. And I think that's just not at all true. I think God is the author of the truth that we discover in science. He's the author of the truth that we find in Scripture. And if they seem to be in conflict, we're just not understanding one or the other. And maybe we're not understanding science correctly. Maybe we're not understanding our faith correctly. But I just believe that if we stay in there long enough, eventually things are going to make sense. There's another obstacle. The other obstacle is philosophical objections. And one of the most common philosophical objections is the problem of evil. I heard someone refer, it seems like a couple times this last week, people referred to this one and said, I'm interested in Christianity, I'm interested in faith, but where does evil come from? Or it could be some other philosophical question. How can such a good God allow for evil things to take place? And I am not a terribly philosophical person. I think I'm a pretty practical person in the way that I think, so I don't get caught up in I don't enjoy philosophical debates all that much. But the way that I've resolved this is by believing that God created us so that we can make meaningful choices. He didn't program us as robots who have to do exactly what he wants us to do. He allowed us to make meaningful choices, even though he knew that some of them would have bad consequences and would result in suffering. That's part of what helps me deal with that philosophical argument. The other part is reminding myself the story isn't finished yet. The story ends with a defeat of evil and the triumph of all things that are good. But sometimes there are legitimate philosophical arguments. Another category of obstacle are personal baggage. Sometimes people can't get to Jesus because of personal baggage in their life, and all of us come with baggage. Baggage could be having been treated poorly by someone who claimed to be a Christian. So you've got some baggage in that you've had a bad experience with someone who claimed to be following Christ. Maybe you've had a bad experience in church. I had a friend who was very opposed to faith, or even talking about it, because as a child he'd been taken to kind of a hellfire and brimstone church with lots of fear and lots of imagery that just really scared him as a child. He wasn't old enough to deal with that, and that experience was so negative he just didn't want to be around it at all. So his baggage was a bad experience in church. Difficult childhood can leave a person with a hard time understanding the concept of anyone loving them. This is all about God loving us and wanting us to be in a relationship where we love him back. And if you've had a hard time loving or had a hard time believing you're lovable, that's baggage it's hard to let go of. Anger at something you've experienced in your life, or maybe some experience that makes it hard for you to trust people. Those are barriers. I have a couple more that I'm going to mention. I'm going to share a few ideas for how to get past the barriers. Another barrier is bad theology. So sometimes we present beliefs to people, or we explain the Bible to people, or we explain the gospel to people in ways that just aren't very helpful. And we make it hard for people to come to Jesus. According to Jesus, bad theology can shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in men or women's faces, or it can create loads that are too heavy for people to bear. Wrong conclusions about who Jesus is, or wrong conclusions about how to be in relationship with him, are especially serious. So much so that in Matthew 23, Jesus actually calls down curses on people who perpetuate these bad beliefs about how to connect with God and do so intentionally. Now, I believe Jesus is loving and patient and kind. I don't think he calls down curses on everyone who makes a theological mistake or draws a wrong conclusion. But when people are intentionally making it hard for people to get to God, I think Christ takes that serious. There's one element of bad theology that I've always regretted, and I actually had a point in my outline kind of built around this one, and then I changed my whole approach. But the point in my outline was that the bad theology, something about coming to Jesus, I must give up my beer. And the reason I share that is I grew up in a family that hadn't been around church a whole lot, in my extended family. And in their eyes, becoming a Christian was, I have to give up my cigarettes, I have to give up drinking, I have to do this and this and this, and none of it was just very attractive. And there may be good reasons for giving up any one of those things, but that's not what faith in Jesus is all about. Faith in Jesus is not a list of do's and don'ts. It's not a call to leave a life that's enjoyable and to trade it in for one that just isn't much fun. Jesus talks about life with Christ as being abundant. I want you to have abundant life. But we can have bad theology that makes faith in Jesus either too hard, or we can have bad theology that makes it too easy. There is a cost to following Christ, but I believe the cost to not following him is always higher than the cost of following him and being his disciple. So bad theology is one example. And the last one that I have is bad examples. When people who, according to Jesus, don't practice what they preach. The most effective way to set up an obstacle between someone and Jesus is to claim that you are following Jesus, claim that you love Jesus, claim that you believe in Jesus, and then just act really crappy. Just be a bad, miserable person, or do things that you shouldn't. Act in ways that are unkind and proud and just grate on people. In fact, I think the two most effective ways of getting people to consider a relationship with Jesus are, first, to live in such a way that we develop the Christian virtues. There's a list of Christian virtues in the New Testament. And the Christian virtues are kindness, compassion, forgiveness, gentleness, self-sacrifice, humility, concern for others, and there are a few others. So one, I think an effective way for us to help people get into a relationship is work on becoming the kind of person who's gentle and kind and patient and attractive in those ways. When we do that, we are becoming more like Jesus. And then just do good stuff. And the just do good stuff comes from Matthew chapter 5. Let me read this passage. Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, how can it ever be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand. It gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So those are some of the obstacles. Lack of information, there are philosophical barriers, logical barriers, baggage, all of those things. How do we get around those? If those are a barrier between a person who is considering a relationship with Christ that they can't get past, what are some suggestions? I have a few. And then next week, we're going to talk about what it means to receive Christ. But here are a few suggestions. One, I think Paige was onto something when she talked about honest prayer. Prayer is just talking to God. And I think a good starting point is blatant honesty. And blatant honesty starts with, I don't know if you are even there. I don't know if you're there. I don't know what kind of person you are. I don't know if you want to interact with me. I've got all kinds of doubts. I really don't think this stuff is true. But if you're there, reveal yourself to me. I want to know you. And then just talk honestly, not in church talk, not in religious jargon, but just bearing your heart and being very honest with your thoughts about God and yourself and the world. That's a good first step. Second step, I think, is to be patient and wait. If you feel like you'd like to be in a relationship but you're not getting anywhere, just be patient and wait. If you've ever been stopped on a highway by an accident, sometimes you can't really go. There's no way to get around it. There's no exit to take. You're just stuck there. But you have to sit and wait, and then someone or something comes along and just removes the obstacle. So sometimes that happens. It's just a matter of waiting. And if it doesn't make sense to you, don't give up. But just wait and see what happens and see if that obstacle is removed. I have two or three more that I'm going to share, and then the praise band will come back up and lead us toward the Lord's table. Another thing you can do is learn more about Jesus. So if you ever, this is the same as any other relationship you might be thinking about. Maybe you're thinking about developing a friendship with someone at work. You're not sure that it's one that you want or not. Well, learn a little bit more about them. So another way is just learn a little bit more about Jesus. And you can do this by reading the Gospels, by joining a Bible study, watching The Chosen on TV, or ask people who claim to have a relationship with Jesus lots of questions. But just try to learn as much as you can. Not committing yourself to a relationship yet, but trying to learn a little bit more. And then the last suggestion I have is to act on what you can believe. Act on what you can believe. There are some people who are attracted to Jesus' teaching. They admire his example, and they enjoy being around other people who claim to have a relationship with Jesus, but they're struggling with some of the beliefs. Well, I think a good thing to do is just act on what you can believe. And if you believe that Jesus is a good moral teacher, start following some of his moral teaching. Start forgiving people who have hurt you. Start serving people who are in need. And act on what you can believe. And I think many times we get to know Jesus through that process. Through the process of forgiving people and doing good things for people in need and hanging out with other people who are doing that, we come to the point where we find that he has become our friend. And then gradually or suddenly, you may just find yourself believing. There's a passage in Revelation 3:20, and I think I heard a million sermons on this. This was a popular passage when I was a kid to do sermons on. So I heard a lot of them, and I've not heard many on it recently. Let me read this verse. This is from Revelation 3:20. This is Jesus speaking. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to open that door. What does it mean to actually receive Jesus? Let me say a prayer as we get ready to go to the Lord's table. Father, I thank you for being a God who loves us. Thank you for being a God who reveals yourself to people. Father, help all of us to know you in the way that you want to be known. Father, help us to have a relationship with you. Help us to receive and to feel love from you, to experience forgiveness from you. Help us to experience a sense of your leading us in our lives and being a part of who we are. Father, I pray that as a church you would help us to be authentic, and genuine and honest and loving and patient. And I pray that in this experience, all of us would be drawn closer to Jesus Christ. I ask this in his name.